I spent nearly 3 decades trying to become a professional artist, but I made more progress in the final 2 years than I had in the 20-something years that came before. Those 2 years gave me the skills not only to go pro, it let me leave my office job and paint portraits full-time. The difference was that I actually stopped worrying about making finished paintings and instead just pinpointed the one skill that was actually keeping me stuck. Today, I'm going to show you how to pinpoint the one skill that's keeping you stuck too, so that you can get unstuck for good. Here's actually what's going on for most painters most of the time. You have a destination in mind, right? You want to be at this professional level. And we can think of that like taking a road trip. Maybe you start in California and you want to wind up in New York. And so you think, oh my gosh, I have a lot of distance to cover. I need to get into the car and start driving. Only instead of driving northeast, you start driving south toward Mexico. That is actually what's happening in a lot of your painting practices. Because you think that putting in some work is going to move you in the right direction, you go into the studio and you just focus on making paintings. But the problem is that there's not like one universal definition of what a better painting is, and there's not a single way to get there. So you actually wind up spending a lot of time moving in a direction that might not actually help you. Take, for instance, these two examples, one from Bouguereau and one from Sorolla. Being able to create each of these pieces, while they have similar fundamentals, require that you practice your painting in pretty different ways. You're going to have to build up different techniques and processes for each one. And what you're probably doing right now is taking a really generalized approach. So that's what we're going to fix. In order to help you do it, I'm going to be building on some things that I've been talking about in previous videos. Specifically, there is a workbook that I shared in my last video that's going to essentially pick up where that last video left off. So I've linked that workbook down in the description. You can go ahead and get your copy. It'll actually walk you through what I covered in the previous video, and then it'll help you with what I'm talking about here. Most painters aren't really working off of a blueprint or a clear plan of where they want to take their work. So you wind up kind of just defaulting to copying the photo. But if you followed along with my last video, you actually have an inspiration board for your unique artistic voice that's showing you what you're trying to build your portfolio and your body of work toward. When it comes to diagnosing what you actually need to work on in your work, we need to have that particular plan in mind, because there is no one-size-fits-all destination for everybody. This, I think, is like the biggest problem with going up to a painter you don't really know that well, showing them your work and saying, what do I need to work on? They could have all different pictures in your head of where they think you're trying to go. But if we have this really clear picture of not only where is your work at right now, but also what does the work look like that you really want to be creating, suddenly it becomes much easier to pinpoint exactly the skill that's holding you back. Now, when it comes to these skills, we can actually think of them like a pyramid. At the base of this pyramid, we have composition. So for instance, let's say you really want to paint portraits. That's what's all over your inspiration board. But when I look at the work you've actually been making, it's all still life. Well, if that's the case, no wonder you feel disconnected from what you want to be painting. That being said, composition isn't really that much of a technical skill. It's more like a prerequisite that if it's not actually synced up, you're probably going to feel kind of frustrated or at least dissatisfied with what you're making. So we have composition at the bottom of the pyramid. Then we go into the next skill, which is drawing. So drawing refers to the basic shapes and proportions of those shapes that actually make your image look like something. So when I talk about drawing, I'm not talking about pencil or charcoal. I'm simply talking about, does your subject look proportional? Are the shapes in the right place to make that happen? After we have drawing, above it, we have value. So that's how light or dark the shapes in your painting actually are. Then the top of the pyramid is split between color and then edges or brushwork. I like to have them side by side because depending on how you're working, it might be that looking at brushwork first makes more sense, Or it might be that looking at color first makes more sense. So why have I divided technique into these very specific domains? The reason is that so many painters take a look at their inspiration board and they start describing it with very subjective terms. They'll say, these paintings are so beautiful. They evoke such a sense of nostalgia. There's an ethereal quality to them. But the problem is that beauty or nostalgia or being moody or ethereal, they're really hard to act on. How do you improve the moodiness of a painting? If I asked 50 painters that question, they would probably give me 50 answers, and they wouldn't be particularly confident in those answers either. Now, by contrast, if we can figure out what concrete qualities of your painting or what concrete qualities of the paintings you admire create that sense of mood or nostalgia or beauty, suddenly we can actually turn this into a really actionable checklist that you can put into practice when you go to paint. This is something I talked a lot about in that previous video. It's how to go from like really subjective qualities of analyzing your favorite art to understanding what tangible qualities you can actually start to put in your paintings to start to bridge that gap. But once you're on board with that concept, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, but there are several gaps that I've identified in really concrete terms between the art that I'm making and the art that I want to make. So how do I know which one of these is most important for me to actually work on? There's a really important reason why I described this as a pyramid. Because if you have a really kind of shaky foundational layer of your pyramid, the rest of it's going to feel really shaky too. You can actually think about this almost as your foundation for a house. If that foundation is crumbling, it doesn't make sense to start changing the curtains and thinking that that's going to pull the house together. All that's going to happen is that your house is going to crumble and you're going to have to replace your curtains later. So what we need to do is we need to actually just fix the most foundational structural problems first. What I actually want to do is I want to walk through actual subscriber paintings and do this diagnosis for you. But first, I'm going to walk you through kind of my thought process or the system that I am employing to figure out how to pinpoint what the biggest problem really is. First things first, I actually want to start by putting the inspiration next to the paintings that I'm analyzing. This is really important. We don't want to do this in theory. We want to look at these side by side, and we want to make sure that that compositional base of the pyramid is actually aligned, because it's going to be really difficult to compare landscapes to pet portraits, for instance. So if those are out of alignment, that would be the first recommendation I would make to somebody. Start actually painting the kinds of subjects that you're interested in. Next, we're going to go to drawing. In order to really see if the drawing is accurate, the best way for me to do that is using something like my Sightwise tool. I rolled this out in a previous video and you all have been absolutely loving it. I'm going to include it in the description of this video as well, along with that workbook that I mentioned that walks you through how to actually do all of this diagnosis for yourself. So if you're not sure whether drawing is an issue for you, I would highly suggest that you use this tool to actually look at your work overlaid on top of your reference to identify whether there are significant drawing issues that are cropping up time and time again. Because if there are, it's really important to fix that first. So let's say, for instance, that you really think your biggest challenge when it comes to painting is your brushwork, but you've just had an incredible breakthrough. You've painted an eye with what feels like just 10 elegant brushstrokes. It feels loose and painterly. It's not overworked in the slightest. And then you realize that the eye is in the wrong spot because your drawing was off. Well, there's no convenient way when it comes to oil painting to just kind of pick it up and move it. You're gonna have to paint over all of it and rework that area. Oftentimes, one of the biggest predictors of having like overworked brush strokes, for instance, or muddy colors is actually just having drawing errors that you're having to fix. That would be the very first step, is use that Sightwise tool to make sure that your drawing isn't actually causing an effect downstream in one of the other areas like color or brushwork. Now, once we've figured out whether drawing is an issue, the next thing I'm going to look at is value. And the easiest way to determine whether value is holding us back is actually just to put everything in grayscale. So put your painting in grayscale, your reference in grayscale, and your inspiration in grayscale. And look to see how dark and light are your inspiration paintings getting, and compare that to your actual work. And while you're in grayscale, we can actually take a look at the mark making as well. Oftentimes it's really much more helpful to look at the mark making without the distraction of color. So you can start to look for, what does the paint texture actually look like? Does it look dry and scumbly, almost like pastel? Does it look really thick and juicy with super intense impasto? What are you seeing in your painting's textures versus your inspiration painting's textures? Finally, we can go ahead and put everything back into color and look for key differences in terms of what colors are showing up dominantly. So are you seeing a lot of really pastel tones like peaches and cyans and bright yellows in your inspiration, whereas your paintings all look like shades of beige? Those are the kinds of things that we want to look for when it comes to color. Here's the impact that this can actually have. I want to use my Minty Matt as an example. Over 3 years and 40 paintings, Matt kept trying to improve his brushwork. It was his #1 goal. And when he came to me, he would have told me that that was his biggest problem. But interestingly, when he followed along with a demo of Daniel Keyes, one of his favorite painters, Matt's brushwork was already really strong. He was able to replicate a lot of the exact kind of brushwork that he loved in Daniel's work. But for whatever reason, whenever he worked from his own references, the brushwork looked totally different. It almost looked like Matt was like doing a paint by numbers. And this actually had us stumped for quite a while. But when we actually went through this process, we were able to realize that the root of the problem wasn't the brushwork at all. The brushwork was actually a symptom. I found out that he was using an app to help him to make decisions about the shapes, values, and colors that he would put down on his canvas. And the result was that it really did feel like he was painting by numbers, even though he was doing it all by hand. Brushwork, it turned out, wasn't actually the missing skill. Breaking his reliance on the app was actually the thing that we needed to give him some help with. When he was no longer using that app to help make sure that he was getting an accurate shape and an accurate value and an accurate color, suddenly the brushwork could actually come through the way he had been hoping. And that's exactly what I want for you in your own work. Let's go ahead and dive into some subscriber examples. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off here with Zanna. And first thing that I noticed just from taking a look at her work is that she's really stylistically aligned with the direction she wants to move in, which is perfect. This is a very clear style that she's working toward. And what I notice in her inspiration board is that we have a lot of tonal figurative pieces. It's usually women with fair skin, dark hair, very high contrast lighting. The color is incredibly tonal, and we often have like a pop of color in the choice of dress or how the body is covered. And I'm already seeing that she's doing a great job of adhering to this in her compositional choices. So I see mostly tonal portraits. I see pops of color like the screen here. I even see a lot of parity in like how the screen is applied. If we take a look, for instance, at the yellow of this painting and we compare that to the green of what she has here, we can see that this actually translates really, really nicely. So already the compositional part of this has been checked off. So next, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at drawing. Now, of course, I don't have any of Zanna's reference material for this, so I can't get really in the weeds about like, hey, is the mouth exactly in this place? But what I do notice, for instance, especially in images like this one, where I can actually see the whole face, is I'm noticing that things feel proportional, they feel symmetrical. Overall, like the anatomical piece feels like we're in pretty good shape. I'm sure there are some little details of areas where features could be adjusted, but overall, it doesn't look like this is something that's holding her back. So now we go up the next rung of the pyramid here, and we look at value. And this is probably the first place where I see a significant opportunity for her. Now let me show you exactly what I mean. So let's take this Mark Dimstetter piece, for instance, that's on her inspiration board. Quickly, I see that we don't have quite the same clear division between what's in the light and what's in the shadow. For instance, the value between the upper lip and the lower lip is very similar here in this piece. Similarly, it's a little bit difficult to tell whether that upper eyelid is like truly in shadow or if she just has eyeshadow on. I think the real opportunity here is to really start visualizing these shadow shapes as being really flat, first and foremost. One easy way to recalibrate this would actually be to do something like a master copy of just the face of one of these paintings from her inspiration board. Put it in grayscale, so don't worry about the color, and just really focus on trying to get this as accurate value-wise as we possibly can, making sure that there's not too much variation in those shadow shapes especially. Next, let's go ahead and go over to Annie. Once again, I'm very, very pleased about the alignment I'm seeing compositionally. So Annie has these really wonderful influence paintings of children. These are often like candid shots, so they really feel like they're injected with personality because these are often outdoor scenes where a child is actually like engaged in an activity versus just posing for the camera or for the painter. And I really see this echoed in the work on her Instagram. So let's go ahead and once again think about this through the lens of our skill pyramid. So first things first, as I'm sure you can guess, that compositional piece is really well aligned. So we're going to give that a check mark. Now let's go ahead and go over to drawing. Once again, I don't have the reference material for all of these images, but if I choose this image as an example here, I don't really have to see the reference image to know that the drawing here is pretty darn accurate. The anatomy looks really solid. I don't see any asymmetries. I don't see any features that look distorted. I just have pretty high confidence as a result that the likeness in this is really solid. I'm going to go ahead and give the drawing side of things a check mark. So let's go ahead and take a look at value. And I actually think the piece that's sitting right next to that one is a great one to look at. And I'm going to pull up a piece from the inspiration board that's of a similar angle. And right off the bat, one thing that I notice is that this image, this inspiration image, it actually has a really strong light and shadow pattern. Whereas in Annie's painting, we don't have that much light and shadow to play with. Because I don't see her reference, I'm not sure if that's just something the reference doesn't have, which is very possible given the strong backlighting on this particular image. But this might be a helpful thing to intentionally move toward in what references you decide to paint. So for instance, a lot of pieces on Annie's board have really strong light and shadow variation or contrast. This painting here is a great example of that. We have very dark shadows in this particular image. But it's not just this one. I really do see this repeated. Even this painting, which doesn't have very big shadow shapes on the face, they're nonetheless very hard-edged, and the contrast is pretty severe between just how dark the shadows get versus how light the skin tones are. This could be something that, Annie, you can actually look for in your reference material, trying to really intentionally get reference that has strong light and shadow. And then making sure that when you actually do have that you make sure your shadows get all the way dark. Now, because it does look like this image is lit from behind, let's go ahead and find an image on here that has similar lighting. Now, this isn't backlit per se. The light's really coming from above on this particular piece, but we don't have any direct lighting on the face. This is absolutely one of the trickiest lighting scenarios to paint, especially for portraits. Something where the entire face is in shadow often makes our work as portrait painters really difficult, and it's often one of the biggest stress tests on our value control. I'll use these paintings from Annie here as a really good example of this. So one thing that I'm noticing is that the reflected light that is bouncing back into the features that are otherwise in shadow, that reflected light is showing up just a little bit too light right now. If I were to put all of this into grayscale and look at my entire screen in black and white, you might notice that in this particular painting, even though we can really very clearly see what areas receive reflected light, the artist is very careful to prevent those areas from becoming so light that they start actually feeling like they are receiving direct light. So notice that the light areas in the face really don't compete with these light areas in the hair in terms of their value. Whereas in Annie's painting, it's a little bit closer together, and that can read as the image feeling a little bit less like three-dimensional. Overall, my biggest suggestion for Annie, I feel like we're on a really good track here. I would just be looking first and foremost to make sure that your reference is setting you up for success with light and shadow patterns that are more conducive to the kind of painting that's on your inspiration board. And then once you're in that place, kind of similar to what I was suggesting to Zanna, make sure that you're allowing your shadows to get dark enough and that you're not kind of artificially lightening some of those areas within the shadow shapes. One really simple exercise that can help recalibrate this anytime for anyone who's having challenges around capturing values in portrait painting specifically would be to take a painting from your inspiration board that has really dark shadows. Bonus points if it's one where you would hesitate to make your own shadows that dark if it were your original painting. Go ahead and put it in black and white and do a master copy where you really focus on getting those shadows dark enough. It'll prove to you just how dark you can go without the skin tone somehow looking disjointed. It can also really prove to you just how flat you can paint those shadow shapes and demonstrate that you really don't have to inject a whole lot of contrast into those shadow areas for it to read as believable. Last up, I have Nicola. I have her inspiration here on the right. We have a lot of very painterly, colorful portraits, and then we have her Instagram here to the left. I'm just gonna say I love all of these subjects that you're painting. I especially love the Baldur's Gate paintings. First thing, compositionally, while we do have like more fandoms on the left and more traditional portraits on the right, when I do look at them from a compositional lens, they feel very similar. Like we have these vignetted head and shoulder portraits on a kind of abstracted, simplified background. So once again, we can kind of check off that compositional box, which is great. The next thing I notice, all of these are characters that I recognize. So once again, I feel like she's done a really great job capturing that accurate drawing or likeness. Well, going into value, if I were to put all of this into grayscale, one thing that I noticed right away is that she has very similar value ranges between her work and her inspiration. So her darks are going dark enough, her lights are going light enough. There's not like too much contrast either. So we do also have appropriate use of midtones that's consistent between her painting and her inspiration. So that actually leaves us with color and with edges. So one thing I noticed when taking a look at her inspiration is that the painters that she's inspired by have a lot of really fun color variation within the skin tones. Take like this Ginny Savile or Jane French example. We have greens, we have purples, we have oranges, we have yellows, we have blues. There are so many different variations in these portraits. And it's not just like one or two of them. I'm seeing this repeated really consistently throughout her inspiration. This could be one opportunity that she could bring into her own pieces. Can we start to look for little variations in hue or temperature and exaggerate them just a little bit until we start to get tones that look yellowy or peachy or green or cyan or whatever color is actually showing up on that person's face. Now, this does get easier when you're working from life versus from some kind of digital image, which a lot of her reference material for these like fan art paintings are inevitably going to be. But that's one possible direction that she could go. The other possibility is that I do see a lot of mark making on here that looks like it was done with a flat brush. So for instance, if we take a look at this Jane French self-portrait, I can see very rectangular brushstrokes. That's kind of the hallmark of using a flat brush. Now, I don't see this style of mark making as much in her own work. Now, that makes sense for a reason I'm about to get into, and it has to do with the medium that she's using. It's just not as conducive to getting those like very rectangular brush marks. So that could be one area of opportunity, but it does bring me to maybe the biggest opportunity that Nicola shared with me when she submitted her work for my review. And that is that she wasn't necessarily concerned with her Instagram page as a whole. She actually showed me an oil piece that is in progress that had become a little bit of a sticking point. And so when I go back to her Instagram, one thing that I want to point out is that a lot of these images are actually done digitally. Now, I don't mean using AI or something like that. I mean using apps like Rebel or Procreate. As I went through her Instagram, I saw a lot of those images were made using those specific tools. Then, of course, we have images that were done in something like graphite or another dry media as well. But I didn't actually see that many examples of oil paintings. When we take a look at this particular piece, what really stands out to me is that if I actually compare this image to her Instagram, suddenly there really does feel like there's a stylistic difference. And that, I think, is the opportunity that we can really focus on, because this almost looks like it was done by a different artist than the work that's on her feed. Here's my takeaway as I take a look at this. I know that she has really strong skills when it comes to her drawing and her value. Her color is also like really solid, even if there's maybe room to play. The gap, in my mind, is her comfort level with oil versus her comfort level with these digital tools. And so the very first thing I would think about in her case is actually pretty simple. And that is, can we just get the same baseline level of comfort with the medium of oil paint that she's able to express with these pieces that are done digitally or with dry media? One opportunity here would be to actually think about getting some oil practice just with black and white. So titanium white and ivory black are the only two colors you put out on your palette. And rather than kind of stressing over mixing the right two pigments together to make the right hue and saturation, all you're having to really think about is going to be your value and then just dealing with the medium. I think the more repetitions, Nicola, that you can actually get with oil paint in as simple of a way as possible, the more quickly you're going to see your work in oil start to look like your work that's digitally created. This is something that I often find with my mentees who are coming in who have like really high proficiency in one medium, but they're newer to oil painting specifically. Usually they have really solid skills when it comes to drawing, value, color, etc. But where they're less comfortable is just with the oil paint itself. And oftentimes the easiest way to get there is just through some patience and repetition. As unsexy as that answer is, taking some pieces that maybe you've already done before and were really successful that you made digitally, and then replicating them just in grayscale with your oil paints can be a really quick way to learn how to make the paint do the kinds of effects that you're used to getting using other tools. My suspicion is once you actually are able to replicate a lot of these in black and white, what you'll actually find is that a lot of what's happening here on your Instagram page already will just click into place when it comes to your oil work. And I think that's when you're going to be able to go back to really play with the color and with the brushwork, the way we talked about when we were looking at your feed combined with your inspiration. Oftentimes, when we think about the issues in our work, we're really thinking about the very top of that pyramid, almost like it's the tip of the iceberg, but we're missing like the core essential problem that's actually creating that symptom. I know you all want to work on brushwork and color, so do I. But the good news is if the problem really is coming down to something much more simple like drawing in value, those issues are actually way simpler to fix. They always involve simpler exercises, and it's much easier to actually make breakthroughs when you're just focusing on that one area. That's exactly how I was able to push through in my own work. It was from actually just going back and working on each skill one at a time. I spent some time working on my drawing and value skill. I put in the time really making sure I was confident with my color mixing. When I put it all together, suddenly it felt easier than it ever had, and I was able to make pieces like this. And that's what I want for you too. If your goal is to really have a big breakthrough in your oil painting this year, you're gonna want a full plan, so watch this video next where I walk through exactly how to make that happen.